My name is Noel Purdy from Starmillis University College in Belfast, and I'm delighted that we have five very different but equally experienced panellists joining us today. I'm going to just give their names at this stage, because each of them then is going to say a few words of introduction about themselves and where they work, and really setting the context for us. But in the order of the programme, maybe that's the easiest, is Mr. Fergal McNamara. He's the principal of Solus Hospital School in Dublin. We have Jenna Lowry, who's a nurture teacher and director of the North Down and Ards Women's Aid, and also Kilcooley Primary School. We have Professor Una O'Connor-Bones, head of the Research Graduate School and deputy director of the UNESCO Centre based in the School of Education at Ulster University. We've got Mr. David Friel, lecturer, placement academic supervisor in the Department of Early Education and Social Studies, ATU. And finally, we have Dr. Maggie Green, also a lecturer in the Department of Early Education and Social Studies in ATU in Donegal. So let's give a warm welcome to our five panellists first of all. And thank you to them for agreeing to really what is quite an unknown experience of coming along to a panel discussion with a roving mic. But before we get to the open-ended questions, each of them was invited to give a few opening remarks, just for a few minutes, I suppose, to tell us as an audience a little bit about themselves and their particular context, and I suppose to give some initial reflections on the conference theme. So the conference theme, just to remind us, is Innovative Pedagogies for Inclusive Education, a very broad theme as we've explored over the last couple of days. But I'm particularly interested in each of our panellists giving a little bit of an insight to kickstart the conversation about how this theme relates to them in their particular context. So I'm sure we'll hear five very different perspectives here, but hopefully with some overlapping themes as well. So to start us off this afternoon, I'm going to ask Una to go first. Professor Una O'Connor-Bones. Una.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Una, and I am, as Noel said, I'm currently the research director in the School of Education. And I suppose my response this afternoon will be based very much with my research hat on, although I do, like many of you here, come from a teaching background initially. But in terms of looking forward in relation to innovative pedagogies in terms of ensuring inclusive education, I would agree that there is a place for that, and that it can significantly contribute to ensuring inclusive education for all learners, but also perhaps with the caveat that it isn't a complete solution on its own. And I suppose in answering that for myself, I'd like to consider by what we mean by innovative pedagogies, just to ensure that we don't lose the baby with the bathwater, if you like. Because many of the core principles, for example, of differentiation or adaptive teaching, are rooted in a very deep experiential and theoretical understanding of what works, that both recognises and respects the diverse needs of learners. And it's important, therefore, that we acknowledge these as valid and valuable interventions, whilst also seeing how their core components can be or have been repurposed, adapted and applied in original, inventive and creative ways. And going back to that caveat that I had, whilst innovative pedagogies offer a great potential for inclusivity, they are in themselves dependent on other factors, and that does include things that have been covered in the conference already: teacher education, equitable access to resources, and a commitment to inclusive values within and across both school policies, but also wider systemic policy. So if we were to think, or if I was to think again with my research hat on, what would these innovative pedagogies look like? Again, I've thought about the characteristics of pedagogies at a macro level, and that would include taking time to sort of step back and identify what is the innovative aspect in relation to the proposed pedagogy, what is its grounding and its relevance to effective educational theories. So in other words, does the proposed pedagogy relate to specific theories that have been shown to be effective in terms of improving learning? What is the level of adoption of those theories in practice? What evidence is there that they have been tested, that their outcomes have been evaluated and have been shown to work? And taking a lens, like a backstep lens like that, would help identify the gaps in our own knowledge, as well as signpost the potential future directions of research that both advance our knowledge, our understanding, and our implementation of innovative pedagogies. And in terms of why something like this matters for policy development, at their core, any kind of innovative or inclusive principles are vital. They're a vital component of policy development, because they do require education systems to be responsible, or to be responsive and to be accountable to fulfilling the needs of all learners. And again, at that fundamental level, they're there to uphold legal and also, importantly, human rights obligations, which really mandate that all children have to receive an equal and an equitable education. And that includes an accessible quality education, an education that recognises the diverse needs of learners, and also the removal of barriers to education for any number of marginalised or vulnerable groups of learners, but that also incorporate an acceptance of and respect for diversity in all of its wonderful, unique forms. So in education terms, the collective impact of that kind of mindset can lead to genuinely child-centred learning environments that recognise the unique contribution that every child can make to their school. And school itself, I think, is also as a reminder for us that school's a microcosm of wider society. So it's also hugely important that one reflects the other and also informs the other, not just the standards but the expectations of both. And in that way, inclusive principles can therefore contribute to social cohesion. They can challenge our perceptions and our expectations of difference, and in doing so, aid development of greater mutual understanding, respect, empathy, and prejudice reduction. And then finally, our question was, who should be involved in the development of these policies? Well, the obvious answer is everyone. Inclusive education, we know, because of the various themes, and I'm probably speaking more from an SEN side of things now, but it has wider relevance. It can be a sensitive and a very emotive issue that requires, I think, what could be best described as a transparent ethical engagement. And that is achieved through a form of participatory dialogue that gathers information from multiple perspectives, importantly from multiple perspectives, whether that's at individual, at institutional or community, and at policy spheres. And that includes people like principals, teachers, parents, pupils, classroom assistants, as well as those wider statutory and non-statutory agencies within and beyond education. And collectively that provides the basis to provide a strong evidence base to inform the direction of policy development and implementation. And as a process, that kind of ethical engagement, the emphasis is on working towards consensus through information, through dialogue and debate, through the building of shared intentions and considering the best way forward. And that top-down, bottom-up approach to kind of policy development demonstrates and I think reinforces for me very importantly that some issues are just far too important and far too sensitive to be the sole decision of policymakers and politicians. So that is my concluding comment.
Thank you very much, Una. And you covered a lot of ground there in a short period of time. So well done for flying through that for us. I'm going to jump next to David. So Una has given us the importance, I suppose, of a rights perspective and particular focus perhaps on disability, special educational needs. David, what about from your perspective?
Well, I suppose just to introduce myself, I apologise. I have laryngitis the last week and a half, so I'm going to try my best to keep up. But I suppose from my perspective, my name is David Fried. I work in A2 alongside Maggie in the Department of Early Education and Social Studies, but I'm also a member of the Irish Traveller community. And for those who are not familiar, Travellers are Ireland's only Indigenous ethnic minority that have a shared history, culture, language and traditions that set us apart from settled people, non-travellers. And I suppose that's probably the first point when we talk about inclusion. So my background would have came from a very heavy community development, Paulo Freire, bell hooks kind of pedagogy of the oppressed, or a critical pedagogy in terms of how we approach inclusive education and how we approach them innovative pedagogies. I think the innovation is there. I think it's hampered by structures, systems, policies, society at large. It's one of the biggest issues. But what I think in terms of our role in education, and when we talk about inclusion, there's a bit of inclusion by exclusion. When I come to these conferences, I never hear anyone talk about travellers. I never hear anyone talk about Roma. I never really hear anyone talk about LGBTQ plus communities, trans communities, you know. It's very much inclusion by what we see and creating inclusion through exclusion. I think that's one of the really important points falling out from that. And in terms of Una's point in relation to human rights and social justice, I think that is the bedrock. But unfortunately, I think it's an ideology. I don't think it's a practice. I think we approach inclusivity in education in a very fluffy way. You know, for example, we'll have Autism Awareness Week was referenced earlier today by Maggie. We'll have Traveller Ethnicity on the 17th of March, where there'll be a celebration, but all them things be packaged back up, as Maggie says, and put away in a box. And then we talk about equality, and I have a real faux pas with equality. And it's an educational, I come from a social care context, so maybe it's a wee bit different as well, but when I come to educational context, I always hear about this equality of access. So when we talk about the equality of access, we're saying we're giving everyone the same opportunity, okay? But the rest lies with you. But the really important part is the equality of participation and outcomes. Because if we look at people with disabilities, for example, they have the same access, arguably, to education, but their participation and outcomes is not the same. Travellers are the same. They get the same access, but only 13% of travellers finish second level education in comparison to 73% of the general population. So equality is not just about giving access, it's about ensuring equality of participation and equality of outcomes. I think that's really important, following on from Una's points. And lastly, I would say, you know, really when we think about inclusive education, innovative pedagogies, when we think about bell hooks, she always says that the classroom remains a radical site of possibility in the academy. And I really believe that. And I really believe that teachers, educators, researchers, and all of us who are involved in education have a real commitment around inclusion. But I think with that, it takes a bit of criticalness. Like I was just listening to Una and the word vulnerable. I hate the word vulnerable. Am I, as a traveller, vulnerable? Who makes me vulnerable? What does vulnerable mean in your head? When I say the word vulnerable, what do you think? What do you imagine? People are not vulnerable. They're at risk, and society makes them at risk. People with disabilities, when they go into the education system, are not vulnerable. It's not that they can't protect themselves. It is people who do it to them. And that's another point that I would like to make in terms of innovative pedagogies, is the deficit lens. We need to move away from the deficits in terms of how we view people. And we know from research, and some people might know a lot more than me, that if we look at educational research, teachers' expectations are one of the most significant predictors of outcomes of students that there is. And I really think we need to really consider that, reflect on that, and think about, as Una quite well said, in terms of the relevance of that theory to the practice. Perfect.
Okay. Thanks, David. Lots of food for thought in that as well, and that notion of inclusion being fluffy. You know, is inclusion fluffy in our conceptualization and our discussion around that as well? Are we happy to stay at the fluffy level of discussion around inclusion? I thought it was really good. So thanks, David. Gonna come back one to Jenna now. Jenna, tell us about your perspective then.
So I work in Cocully Primary School, which is an area of high social deprivation. It's in the middle of a loyalist estate in County Down, and I feel a wee bit of a fraud actually talking about this being maybe presented as an innovative strategy, because we've been a nurture school for 16 years, and and even across the water in the UK, they've had nurture skills for a lot longer. So when you are talking to other people, they don't know what the word nurture is. And it doesn't just apply to areas of social deprivation, although that's where we get the funding from. There's now 62 schools in Northern Ireland that have nurture groups, just in primary school at the moment, and there was hope to expand obviously to post-primary, and some of them do have their own self-funded, and they're trying their best basically, and that is in special schools and also in post-primary. So we're a trauma-informed practice school, and but what I would sort of argue, and thinking about the other speakers that are here, is that it should really be the basis for everything in every school. No matter what, where your area is, and it should, to access the curriculum, it should be the very bottom of that triangle, and that's what everybody should be going in from that perspective, but not enough of us are really understanding about trauma responses, but just being a human. And a lot of what I've loved hearing from other people are the relationships, that's crucial, and the connection. So when people were speaking about that in the conference, I really enjoyed hearing about that. It does fill me with a lot of anxiety hearing about new and innovative pedagogies as a teacher and a practitioner. And the reason for that is because a lot of these things are repackaged with a new piece of funding, and at the moment, to be quite honest, all my colleagues, and not just in my setting, but across our whole area and beyond, they're on their knees. They are burnt out, and they could not take one more new thing. It would push them over the edge, and I'm really actually simplifying that, but it's quite a scary level. So although my funding is actually for, in case anybody doesn't really know what a nurture group is, it's for an early intervention program. Children are selected using what's called a Boxall profile, and it's based on their social emotional difficulties, but that they are a group and they're set up in a classroom that is sort of putting those things back in place that they missed in their early development. The classroom is very different. It's set up like a house, and there's a kitchen, and lots of those sort of early things that other children would have had. We do theraplay and putting in those sort of baby massage things that other more privileged children would have got, to put those sort of building blocks back in place. That's what we're funded for, about 6 to 12 children for 1 to 3 terms. There's myself, and then there's a classroom assistant that's trained and qualified to do that. But that's not really, and they are looking at this, because I think it was based on and funded by a piece of research in 2013 from Queen's, and they are actually looking at that to see if they're going to have to do more research because the children and the profiles are changing. So that model, which would be called the classic model, they're thinking that there maybe is alternatives that are going to be more beneficial. So that's, and I agree, because that's not really where the great work does with those children, 6 to 12 children, and they kind of get their terms and they go on. You know, it's with the other support, the support of staff, the support of parents that we get in, and really treating the whole community. What I will also say about Cuchulaí is recently which is a beautiful thing about integration is, and it's not just our school, but they have what's called SPIM classes now, which stands for Specialist Provision Inside Mainstream. We have 9 of those, which includes severe learning difficulty classes, language or learning support classes, and social communication classes, and they're actually now tipping the balance, so we have more of those classes than we do in mainstream. So it's real, it's a working really beautifully, and everybody's working really hard, and it's really interesting to see how we're working towards inclusivity within that setting and getting those children to be involved with the mainstream. So that has been a real lovely thing, and all those children don't come from the estate as well, so seeing all of that is really a beautiful thing. And I would say that if you want to see any creativity and innovation, it's to go to any area of social deprivation. Those teachers are scrappy and they're always at the forefront of anything new. So yes, I would say that is just some of my thoughts, I guess, about inclusion, and basically, to sum it up, I think happy teachers create happy children, and happy children are learning children, and it's just something to maybe invest in our teachers.
Okay, thanks, Jenna. And I couldn't help but think that the contrast between your setting and what we heard about from John talking about Mountjoy Prison, and yet there's so many overlaps there in terms of humanity and connection and relationship, and exactly the same themes that John talked about. So there's a lot in your last few remarks as well that we can, I'm sure, explore in a few moments. I'm going to move on though to our fourth panellist, and that's Fergal. Fergal, over to you to tell us about your particular take on inclusion.
Yeah, so I'm Fergal, and I'm the principal of Sullis Hospital School, which is a Department of Ed school that is based within Crumlin Children's Hospital in Dublin. And we teach the kids who are inpatients in the hospital. So I suppose every day we have about 80 to 100 children that are of school-going age, and over the course of a school year we'd provide an educational service to about between 2,500 students to 3,000 students. And to do that we've got 7 teaching staff that are split between primary and post-primary, and in many ways our school really operates an inclusive approach because all children can be sick and can be hospitalized. So we would teach across the whole spectrum of needs, the whole spectrum of cultures in Ireland, and I suppose those kids as well, because they're ill, would have fluctuating capacities to learn. So our teachers would be, I suppose, dealing with children whose they have to differentiate to in real time. They can't plan to differentiate because every day they go to meet the child, based on their illness, their capacity to learn could be different to yesterday. So I suppose one of the innovative pedagogies that we would have embraced is universal design for learning because of its flexible, adaptable approach. In many ways, I suppose it's an approach that we recognized when we first came across it, as opposed to being a new approach for us. It was more putting words on what we would have been trying to do every day. So from that perspective, we would consider our school to be quite an inclusive school by necessity. And I suppose my thoughts then, from a policy point of view, our kids are also somewhat invisible to the system because we are not currently recognised by the NCSE as special education, despite being a special school recognised by the department. Hospital schools have been in existence since the 1960s. But we're not mentioned anywhere in any department policies. We're not described or categorized as a type or form of special school. So we kind of fall in a bit of a liminal space. From a European perspective, the rights of children with medical and mental health needs would have been set out in UNCRC and in the EACH, or the European Association of Children in Hospital Charter, in the 80s. And many other jurisdictions are operating kind of clear learning pathways for children with medical and mental health needs, but not in the Republic of Ireland. My understanding across the border in Northern Ireland, similar to many, to I suppose the 4 UK countries, they do have legislation looking after the rights of education for children with medical and mental health needs. And I believe there's a duty for the Educational Authority in the North to provide education both to kids with long-term illness and temporary illness. And that's something that I'd be hoping that down south we might look towards. So I suppose my concerns around inclusion of the children that we teach is very much at a policy level. And across the island, I suppose there's also a bit of a postcode lottery because not all paediatric inpatient units in Ireland have access to a hospital school. It's only those, I suppose, who have historically had a school in place from whatever order or independent organisation had set up that hospital. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Fergal. And Fergal raised a couple of interesting points there, including that idea of children being visible or invisible in the system, and certainly I'm sure that's a theme that we'll explore in a few moments as well. last but not least, we come to Maggie. I had the privilege of being in Maggie's parallel session this morning. It was a wonderful session around autism with 4 wonderful speakers. But Maggie, we've left you to last, but that's no reflection of how important your theme is. So tell us about your particular context.
Thank you, Noel. So I'm very conscious of the number of people I've cited in my work here sitting in this room. So you'll excuse me if I don't cover every single aspect of this. I'm going to come at it from a very personal perspective, and John, you completely flipped where I was going with this today, because you mentioned the primary certificate that people used to get. My understandings of inclusion began very early in life because my parents only ever got their primary certificates. So for me, education has always been a privilege. It's something that I've always felt very lucky to be able to avail of. And it's something that I've been cognizant of as well in relation to access to education and access to inclusive education. My parents left school when they were 11 and 12 respectively. My mother was hired out at hire and fairs. She never had an inclusive experience of school, and neither did my father. Come up to me, and I went to school and didn't experience inclusion, and now I look at my own children. I became a teacher because I wanted to create inclusive spaces for children. I wanted to be a different type of teacher to what my parents had experienced and what I had experienced. And sometimes I think, I see inclusion and the inclusive pedagogies that people are using, and sometimes it's a difficult piece to look at because we're shouting it from the rooftops, but it's not wholly been enacted on the ground. And for me, I decided to do a wee bit of research into a particular group of marginalised students, and I looked at autistic, trans and non-binary students in the Irish education system, and I looked at them through primary, post-primary and third level, and it was participatory, and I worked very closely with the participants in my study. And what was coming out largely was that, yeah, the schools were saying that they were inclusive and that everybody matters, but everybody matters unless you don't. It's about visibility. It's about if people actually see you. It's about if you are seeing yourself in the curriculum, if you are seeing yourself in the classroom, if you can relate to the teacher who is there with you. And largely, the participants in my study couldn't. And they stated that school was a difficult place and they never once felt included, which is quite stark. And some of their stories were harrowing. So when I think about inclusive pedagogies, I think, well, actually we need to strip it back further. We need to go back to look at the management of a school. We need to look at the teachers working in the school, and we need to support our teachers. When I look at the teachers that I've spoken to over the years, I used to go out at the NCSE in the area of autism to visit schools, and a lot of the teachers desperately wanted to support their students. And they were coming from this place of really wanting to make a change, but didn't feel that they were supported in being able to do that always. So it comes back to that knowledge base, it comes back to education, it comes back to sustained education. David, who I work with, whose name I just forgot because I'm nervous, spoke about how I had mentioned about the pieces that were boxed up in relation to the tokenistic approaches to inclusion. I've seen that in my own experience as a teacher. I've seen those posters go up in relation to autism awareness, whereas it should be more towards understanding. And I've seen the posters come down again and go away until next year. I've seen as well in schools where it's for June, we'll talk about Pride and then we'll forget all about it after that. And those students aren't seeing themselves represented every single day. So we can roll out all of the different strategies that are focused on particular students, but never consider the intersectional pieces. There are loads of different identities and there are loads of intersections between those identities, and I think that we need to inform our teachers, we need to support our teachers in relation to supporting the students, because the poor experiences that the students I spoke to or spoke to in my research, I wouldn't want that replicated for anybody. So I think that that's where we need to go. We need to strip it all back.
Okay, thanks Maggie for that, and thank you to all the panellists for their initial remarks. You can see the breadth and diversity in the panel members here. I mean, certainly there's a wide range of marginalised groups who are represented here. This is not an exhaustive list either, of course, of those who may feel marginalised in society in general and in our education system. So just to make that point, but we do have some very experienced representatives here advocating for particular groups. At this point, this is the bit where you get involved. I think there's a roving mic. I can see Tricia holding the mic aloft here. So if anybody has a comment or a question, we've got a little bit of time to open it up to the floor. So just raise your hand if you have a comment. There's Kathy to start off. Thank you very much. And when we have the questions, I should say to my panelists here as well, we don't all have to answer it. So if you just raise your hand, if you've got a comment to make, we'll maybe have a couple of responses from the panel members, and then we can go on to another question. So don't feel everybody has to answer every question. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, Noel. And thanks to the panel for those talks. There are so many points that could be made and so many profound issues raised. I just want to reference David. And David talked about how innovative pedagogies are hampered by structures, words to this effect, and society at large. And I can get what you're saying and why you're saying it. It also links to Maggie's point just made a moment ago. And David, you talked about the importance of equality of participation, among other types of equalities. And it just occurs to me that when I look at the title of our conference theme, Innovative Pedagogies for Inclusive Education, and maybe the issue is using the word innovative, and maybe we need to get away, if you're talking about equality of participation, don't we need to consider words like innovative as maybe part of the structure that becomes a barrier? Maybe we need to get away from the notion of something innovative, and we all know about how we can have lots of innovation and yet no change. But it's a word that is maybe overused, and maybe and yet it's a barrier. So we want to get away from the notion of some kind of pedagogy being special, being extraordinary, being different, and move in towards pedagogies, especially in relation to participation that you mentioned, equality of participation, in the moment-by-moment enactment of classroom life. We need to get away from it being special to it being ordinary, everyday, routine, same, moment by moment. Do we encourage all learners in whatever level of the sector we're in to be fully participating in the learning that is on offer? Which begs the question again, of course, what kind of learning is on offer? You know, what is available to be learned? Which I think is a fabulous question. Many of you know it's been mentioned many times, but that question of what is available to be learned by everybody in the class, or in the group, or in the lecture theatre, or whatever the setting is. So it's kind of a statement, and maybe you can find a question in it, David or Maggie. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. There's about 10 questions in there. David, would you like to start?
I'm glad that someone understood what I was saying. So sometimes you're speaking to a room and you're looking around thinking, these people probably think they just rolled me up here. I don't know what's going on. But I totally agree with you. What I would ask people to think about, my grandmother was 90 years of age when she passed away. She passed away last year. And she never went to school a day in her life. And when she did go to school, they used to stand her at the door and delouse her and wash her down because she was a travelling woman. And that's what they done when travellers came around to different schools. And she says to me one day, she says, David, what does it mean to be educated? I thought, do you know what, that's a good question. I says, well, you know a lot of stuff about a subject, and maybe you apply it. So she says, if I knew that whole cookbook up my press there, would you say I'm educated? I says, well, no, you'd have some kind of knowledge. And it's the notion, what she was trying to pull out of me, because they call it, in the traveller community, if you go to school, you go to university, you're called a scholar. Oh, you're really smart, because not many people can write their name and have literacy skills. So what she was trying to pull out that there's more types of knowledge than just books. And why do we legitimise certain types of knowledge over others? And that comes back to the word of innovative. Who determines, or who has the power or authority to determine what is considered innovative? You know? That's a really good question. What I see as innovative and what you see as innovative could be two different things. The second thing is innovative pedagogies. If you go back to the likes of Paulo Freire, the third most cited book in the world around education, he talks about dialogical education. He talks about mutual inquiry. How do we create participation? How do we create the conditions for individuals to be autonomous and become more fully human and liberated? Education can do two things. It can liberate people or it can oppress them. And you're totally right. It's actually, and what Maggie was saying, it's stripping it right back down. And when we talk about spaces, another one I found it very interesting, and I had some individual conversations about safe spaces. It's a load of shit. Excuse my French. No safe, because when I used to go into conferences and into trainings, people used to say, this is a safe space, right? And Joe and Mary would be sitting across from me and they'd be discriminatory about travellers, or they'd be talking negatively or being transphobic. That's not safe. Safety is a very relative term. But what I would ask everyone to think about here today, and think about when you leave on the back of that very good explanation, is how do we be brave? How do we be brave to question, to reflect, to be critical on our biases, on our approaches to inclusive education, on our approaches to pedagogy, and our approaches to participation and outcomes? So forget about the safe. We can't guarantee safety. But what we can do for ourselves is become brave and to question, become critical, and to improve inclusive education for all, not just subsections, for all in society who live in the shadows of oppression. So thanks very much for that question. It gave me a wee bit of oomph to go again. It's nice to get the feedback.
David's only getting started now, but would anybody else like to comment or respond to Kathy's question? Any other panel members?
David and I disagree in the safe spaces thing, and the reason that we do is because in my research it came out very clearly from the participants that they had to find safe spaces, and largely because of what David was saying, you know, places were being posited as being inclusive. And this was an approach, a strategy that was used in the school, that there were rooms in the school that were more inclusive than others for some reason, that they could go to. But actually where they found their safety was through the exclusion that they experienced, because they actually found people who, like them, had been excluded, and who they, I suppose, their experiences resonated with each other. So for them, that's how they described their safety. So I suppose it's outside of that piece where you're in a room. So I suppose the strategies sometimes and the innovative pedagogies that we use, sometimes we don't need to make things as complicated as we do. You know, sometimes it's about taking the voice of the students and applying what they're asking for and applying it consistently across and sustaining it across the board for them.
I'm going to try and elicit another question from our audience. Anybody else? Right in the middle there. Thanks, Tricia.
I'm going to try to find the question in this. There's a bit of a comment and get on to the question, which is one of my pet peeves myself. Because I was a bit nervous about whether I would ask something like this or not earlier, but I think Maggie and David, you've both given me the courage to ask it, is because I think the idea of inclusion as a principle is, you know, you'll find very few people, I think, in education circles or in policy that will disagree with that. But whether the inclusive measures or the things we call inclusive measures work or not, it's whether the people in the spaces feel included or not is really the measure, I think. And I suppose I just ask, and everybody really on the panel touched on this in some way, so could any of you, or would you identify some exclusionary belief or practice that you encounter in your work that you would like to see removed to bring about inclusivity?
The other panel members maybe to respond to that one. Jenna?
I maybe have something, because when you were talking I was thinking about the specific setting that I'm in, and we have worked towards diversity and inclusion. One of the things that we did years ago was look at our library, and we did an audit of the books that we had in there, and it was like maybe under 2% that weren't white Christian books. So we put money in towards including letting other children be. Actually, this started off on the fact that we were seeing children in the early years put in black babies in the oven in their role play area, and that was very disturbing. And there would be a lot of racism in our area. And I guess the challenge that we would find in our school is not only funding those sorts of books and things like that, but allowing the teachers to feel safe to have. I think a lot of the teachers want to do those lessons or inclusivity and create those books, but I know that some of the books that I bought were kind of put away because the teachers were scared to put them out and their children go back home and say what we have talked about, be that different family dynamics. So yeah, I think it's creating sort of maybe structures to protect teachers, but yes, they definitely, we would have felt, and I would have been included in that, scared to be as inclusive as I would want to be, really.
Any comments from Fergal?
Yeah, well, I suppose where I see kind of exclusionary practices would be around the children that we teach, like even in paediatric services that have hospital schools, children are discharged to adult services anywhere between 13, 14 years of age. 16 is the official cutoff, but depending on their lifelong illness, some start transition to adult services as young as 13 years old. And the minute they're into adult services, there's no educational support, and they miss significant amounts of school during the year. And I suppose if we look at, say, an organisation like TUSLA, who would put the cut-off at 20 days absence, they'd want to start looking at stepping in now. Whether they, I mean, it's a lot longer before they do start stepping in, but I mean, 20 days is nothing for a child with a lifelong illness in terms of missing. But because they can tick it off that it's because medical illness and they're in hospital, well, that's fine. But there's no process or pathway for them to continue their education while they're missing all that school. But it would be considered a welfare issue if they weren't ill.
David?
I was just going to say very quickly, I know some people wouldn't believe this, but I actually went to segregated early education up into primary school. So I went to a travel-only creche, a travel-only preschool, and then in 2006 the legislation came out that travel-only or segregated education provision wasn't allowed. And I went to a mainstream primary school in the country, and basically at that time what happened was they started then trying to send travellers to special schools. So for example, in Donegal there's a school called St Bernadette's, and they said to my mother and father that I had ADHD, and they says, well, who diagnosed him? Oh, the resource teacher. You know, she took him out and she can see he can't sit in the seat, can't sit still. And my mother and father at that time had no education, very similar to Maggie, left education very young, but they went back through traveller education initiatives and were starting to get educated very slowly. And they says, no, we're not sending them. And then I kind of went through school and navigated, negotiated different challenges and exclusionary measures that you would face. I'll never forget one day sitting in English. An English teacher was talking about Romeo and Juliet, and there's no reference to travellers in the curriculum at all. Very little. There's a traveller education bill, hasn't been passed, and the NCCA has done some work on it in terms of a resource for teachers, as you just said, to support them to teach it. But I'll never forget her one day saying, write an imaginary, fictive essay about Romeo and Juliet, but imagine what would happen if it was real life, if they were like tinkers on the side of the road and their family was feuding, you know, what would happen? And that was the only mention of travellers in the curriculum that I ever experienced at second level. And then I went on to my degree and I went into social care work and I went into community development and had a different perspective on exclusion and education. And just most recently, when we talk about education and we talk about exclusionary practices, the majority of travellers across the country, and most of you are probably familiar, are on reduced timetables. When we talk about behaviour management strategies, we're talking about inclusive practices where teachers, because of pressures, no doubt, I do think it's a structural issue, are reverting to a new form of segregation in many ways, of putting pupils on reduced timetables, but marking them attended every day, that they're not absent because of the legislation, obviously, until they're 16. in terms of their education. And it goes back to that participation and outcome. How are them children on them reduced timetables for long periods of time going to have the same outcome? So exclusion manifests in very different ways, in terms of representation, practices, pedagogies, and so on. But what I would say is that, and it was alluded to this morning, teachers do a great job. If I didn't meet my lecturer at the end of when I done my undergrad, I wouldn't be here. But there's a lot of the things that we could do better on, and that's like every profession, and I think there's a history there, there's a context at the moment that we need to be very critical about and to work on. So that's what I was just thinking when you asked that question.
I have to bring in...
just say
well,
quickly
yes,
about something David had said. There's just recent in the North changes about that, about not doing reduced timetables, even within the last year. So that's positive. Hopefully it'll expand more.
It's being misused, unfortunately, and abused in education as a behaviour management, because what I didn't realise about teachers was that, and maybe it's changed, so someone please correct me, but there's not a lot about trauma. There's not a lot about relationships. There's not a lot about behaviours or concern or challenge behaviours in the training. So when it comes to behaviour management, it's very difficult, and there's very little options there in terms of how you address that.
At this point?
Just very quickly, in terms of, occasions perhaps when you see exclusion or exclusive practice, just to mention a piece of research I've been involved in recently, and it's looking about the role of classroom assistants or special needs assistants, as you would have, and where that nexus is between the support perhaps that a child gets from a teacher versus the support that they get from an assistant, and which is the most appropriate support to have in terms of that child being fully included or potentially excluded from access to their education. It's not about teacher bashing, and it's certainly not about classroom assistant bashing, because as David said, it's a structural and a systemic issue that I think is literally the pressure point is there now already, and it's been probably one of the most fascinating pieces of research that I've been involved in, to see where those pressure points exist and how have we got to this state where perhaps a child's education is being fundamentally supported by an assistant rather than the teacher. And there are a lot of very important conversations to be had around that in terms of how do we progress and how do we move on from this particular situation for the benefit of everybody. As one colleague who isn't here today but very, very eloquently wrote, when the most vulnerable child in the class is placed with the most vulnerable adult, what is supportive and what is inclusive about that? And I think it's a conversation that we do still need to have.
Absolutely. I've told one or two people. I was over visiting friends in Switzerland about a month ago, and I spoke to a friend of mine who's training to be a specialist teacher, and I was asking him about that, and he was explaining he's working 4 days a week in his local primary school. He's 1 day a week doing a master's course in the next town. And I said, yeah, so is your role, how does that differ from classroom assistant? And he looked at me, classroom assistant? He didn't really understand what that meant, because in his school they have maybe 15 primary school teachers, and then they have 5 master's level trained specialist teachers who are working sometimes one-to-one, sometimes in small groups, sometimes taking the whole class, sometimes withdrawing pupils, sometimes in class and so on. And that's the model that they have, rather than the model that we have and have had for many years, and perhaps unquestioningly as well. So there are other models out there, I suppose, as well. We've got time for one final question before I ask our panellists to sum up their thoughts. Have we got one more question, one more quick question? Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara McConnell from Stranmillis. I suppose my question is really thinking about teacher education, and asking the panel, are there ways that we can make our student teachers, selecting more representation of some of the groups that you're talking about into teacher education?
Great question. Who would like to start off with that one? Una, do you want to kick off on that one?
Yeah, well, I think someone in the parallel session this morning, mentioned that most schools are white middle class female teachers, and I don't think anyone would argue with that. I think it's not so much about the recruitment, it's what do we do to advertise, to promote and to encourage applications. Is there something on the recruitment and the marketing around education where we need to begin to make it a much more appealing and a realistic and a viable option for a wider cohort of applicants. I don't know whether it says something about just the makeup of our society at the minute and whether we need to begin to move in a slightly different direction, but there's certainly a conversation to be had at that marketing and recruitment and promotional level to encourage a level of applications from a broader cohort of applicants. I know we have become better, I think, at identifying people perhaps who come with APEL, with alternative education qualifications, who might be able to enter into teacher education that way. But we're nowhere near there yet. So I agree 100% that there's definitely work to be done on that, and it would be great to see that diversity beginning to filter through into our education system.
What about south of the border? Are things better in the south, Maggie?
I suppose when you asked that question, one of the things that came to mind for me in relation to teacher education was this segregated piece of, here's your module on special educational needs, here's your module on diversity, and they sit over there away from other pieces. So I think there's the embedding of those pieces into teacher training as well. I know certainly when I went into the classroom, I hadn't a notion in terms of how to engage in meaningful inclusion, and I feel when I look back at my practice as a much younger teacher, some of it was probably inauthentic, whereas now I have better understandings. So I think we have the opportunity to embed that for our student teachers going out.
So it's not just about recruitment, it's about the infusion of principles through initial teacher education, really, is what we're hearing there. I'm very conscious of time, and I'm going to ask each panel member now to try and sum up their thoughts. So the theme of the conference, to remind us all, is Innovative Pedagogies for Inclusive Education, and we can interrogate a lot of the terminology in that. But if you could implement one change to promote inclusive education for your context, what would that one change be? So if you could implement one change to promote and develop inclusive education in your particular context in Ireland, north or south, what would that be? I'm going to go in the reverse order from the order I went in last time. So I'm going to start with Maggie this time, and I'd ask you to keep your comments to literally 2 or 3 sentences, and then we'll conclude. Thanks, Maggie.
Perfect. I suppose for me it's thinking about how we can meaningfully include the voices of the students that we're talking about, the students that are marginalised within the school system, to allow for a real sense of belonging for them within their schools and within their settings. And I suppose that comes back as well to training for teachers, so that the meaningful inclusion of student voice for me is one of the biggest pieces.
Thank you. Virgil, you're next.
Yeah, I suppose for me and the context that I work in, really what we would need is a clear, flexible learning pathway for children with medical needs, which is a very simple sentence, but it would require a lot of policy changes, just in terms of even recognising them as a category of special educational need.
Okay, thank you. Jenna?
Yeah, I think that if our structure of our schools are now having more inclusive classrooms within mainstream settings, I would question the need for a separate degree for special educational needs or specialty in that, and I definitely felt very underprepared for the cohort of children that I was teaching, so that would be a wish. And just really at beginning teacher level, if there was work done on before they put their foot in the classroom on their own biases and self-awareness of where they come from, and before they do any damage to the children when they put their foot through the door, that would be my wish. Yeah.
Thank you. David?
I think we touched on a lot, but what I would say would be the piece around the human rights, the social justice, that becomes back to be the bedrock and the critical pedagogy, in terms of we go back to that point where we dismantle the inherent power dynamics that is in education between the learner and the educator, and we give a space for my students and every student to become more fully human. And when I say that, I mean in a way that they're more autonomous, they have a self-determination, and that inclusion is not this buzzword, that it's normality, that it's the reality of everyday life, not an ideal, but it's an action and a reality. That's what I would love going forward.
Brilliant. And finally then, Una.
You know, I was so inspired by what John said, and for me it's always been, it's the relationships first, and sometimes we forget that and we lose sight of it because we're blinded by all this other stuff that's coming our direction. But it is that fundamental relationships. And what I always say to students is always, always, always have high expectations. And it goes back to that. It's about, I believe in you, I know you can do this, I trust in you, I encourage you. And those high expectations will be different depending on the child, but I absolutely 100% believe in you. And that will move mountains.
Could we give our panellists a warm round of applause?